The air in Montana tasted like ash and broken promises. There's a herd of yearlings trapped near Miller's Creek. I have to go. He had believed her. He always believed her. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence in the ranch house felt heavy, almost accusatory. Devereaux swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet hitting the hardwood floor. He walked over to the dresser, intending to get a glass of water, but stopped. There, resting beside her discarded silver earrings, was a crumpled receipt she had emptied from her pockets. He smoothed it out with his thumb. It wasn't from the veterinary supply store. It was from a high-end boutique in Bozeman, dated 2 days ago. A charge for a silk scarf. Evelina didn't wear silk scarves to treat burned cattle. A tight, sickening knot formed in the pit of his stomach. He moved toward her closet. Her heavy, ash-stained work boots were still sitting perfectly aligned on the rack. The boots she wore to every emergency call. Devereaux closed his eyes, a sharp breath tearing through his chest. He walked into the bathroom. Her side of the vanity was neat, but a faint, lingering scent hung in the stagnant air. It wasn't the harsh, chemical bite of clinical antiseptic or the familiar, smoky scent of the outdoors that usually clung to her hair. It was a dark, expensive fragrance, notes of vanilla, night-blooming jasmine, and something sharp and metallic. A scent that didn't belong to his wife. A scent that didn't belong in their house. The intuition, dark and primal, hit him like a physical blow. A man knows the rhythm of his own marriage. He knows the subtle shifts in the current, the slight stiffening of a spine during an embrace, the way a gaze averts just a second too quickly. Devereaux had been ignoring the signs, burying them beneath the excuse of the chaotic fire season. He moved methodically now, his heart hammering a dull, steady rhythm against his ribs. He pulled on his dark denim jeans, a black t-shirt, and his worn leather boots. He grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter, the metal biting into his palm. Stepping out onto the porch, the heat instantly swallowed him. The horizon was a jagged line of glowing embers, painting the night sky in apocalyptic hues. The air tasted like ash and broken promises. Far down the long, winding dirt driveway, he saw them. The faint, red taillights of Evelina's heavy-duty truck, creeping quietly toward the main highway without its headlights on. She was trying not to wake him. She was sneaking out. Devereaux climbed into his own truck, leaving the headlights off. He turned the key, the engine purring to life with a low, menacing growl. He didn't know where she was going, and a part of his soul screamed at him to go back inside, to pretend he was still asleep, to keep his fragile world intact. But the betrayal was already a cancer, eating away at the edges of his mind. He shifted into gear, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. He followed his wife into the burning, suffocating night, completely unaware that the truth waiting for him in the dark would be far more devastating than any wildfire. Devereaux kept an agonizingly wide distance, allowing the thick, swirling dust of the dirt road to settle before his heavy tires crushed the same gravel. He drove by the pale, hazy illumination of the moon, only flicking his headlights on when he finally reached the paved stretch of County Road 9. The sky ahead was an angry, bruised purple, underlit by the sprawling inferno devouring the eastern ridge. 2 miles ahead, Evelina's taillights were twin red demons leading him deeper into the suffocating night. She was driving fast, taking the hairpin turns of the mountain pass with a reckless familiarity that made Devereaux's chest tighten. She was not heading toward the valley. The makeshift veterinary triage center was 20 miles in the opposite direction, safely away from the active fire lines. She was driving straight toward the quarantine zone of Blackwood Ridge. The realization hit him like a cold stone dropping into his stomach. He gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned a bloodless white. The silence in the cab of his truck was deafening, leaving him trapped with the ghosts of their 7-year marriage. He remembered the Evelina he had married, a fierce, compassionate woman who had once spent 3 sleepless nights bottle-feeding a premature foal in his barn. Back then, her eyes had held nothing but warmth and an unwavering loyalty. They had built their life on the solid foundation of the Montana earth, a partnership forged in shared labor and quiet, profound love. But as the miles rolled away beneath his tires, that pristine image began to warp and fracture, replaced by the secretive stranger who had been occupying his house for the past month. Devereux sifted through the ashes of the last few weeks, suddenly recognizing the glaring red flags he had desperately chosen to ignore. The way her phone screen was always tilted away from his line of sight when she texted at the dinner table. The sudden, unexplained changes to her lock screen password. The meticulously clean blouses she wore to supposedly messy trio shifts, only to return home smelling inexplicably of vanilla and night-blooming jasmine rather than smoke and iodine. He had let her blame the fires. He had let her weaponize her noble profession to carve out a secret, shadowy life in the dead of night. A sharp curve in the road snapped his attention back to the present. Evelina's truck veered off the main highway, her tires kicking up a massive cloud of dry earth as she turned onto an overgrown logging road. A bright yellow county barricade reading "Road Closed." Fire hazard had been pushed carelessly onto the shoulder. Devereux slowed his vehicle, letting the engine idle at the edge of the turnoff. The dilemma tore at the very fabric of his pride. He could put the truck in reverse right now. He could drive back to the ranch, pour himself 3 fingers of cheap bourbon, and crawl back into bed. He could wake up tomorrow and pretend the boutique receipt, the lingering perfume, and this dark mountain drive were nothing but the paranoid delusions of an exhausted husband. If he turned back, he could preserve the illusion of his marriage. But the stoic rancher sitting in the dark cab knew the truth. The marriage was already a hollow shell. He was just driving to the funeral. His jaw locked, a heavy muscle ticking in his cheek. Devereux shifted the truck back into gear and steered past the yellow barricade, his tires chewing into the untamed dirt path. He plunged into the dense, smoke-choked shadows of the encroaching forest, guided only by the distant, damning glow of his wife's taillights. The logging road narrowed into a treacherous, rutted path, forcing Devereux to cut his engine and coast to a silent stop behind a thicket of dying ponderosa pines. The air up here was brutally hot, thick with the acrid stench of burning timber from the ridge just a few miles away. Fine white ash fell through the canopy like demonic snow, dusting the hood of his truck. He stepped out, the dry pine needles crunching softly beneath his leather boots. Ahead, through the dense, smoke-choked foliage, a faint, unnatural yellow light bled into the darkness. Devereux moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, his heart hammering a violent, sickening rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to flee back down the mountain before the truth could brand itself into his retinas. But the gravity of betrayal pulled him forward. He broke through the tree line and stopped. Nestled in a small, forgotten clearing stood an old hunting cabin, a dilapidated structure that hadn't been used in decades. Parked out front, hidden safely from the main road, were 2 vehicles. One was Evelina's familiar silver truck. The other was a sleek, black SUV. As Devereux crept closer, using the shadows of the massive pines as cover, he noticed a laminated placard dangling from the SUV's rearview mirror. It was a press pass. Channel 7 local news. The knot in his stomach pulled painfully tight. He knew that vehicle. It belonged to Xantha, the sharp-featured, aggressively ambitious reporter who had been swarming the county for weeks, shoving microphones into the faces of exhausted firefighters and ruined ranchers. Why would his wife be meeting a journalist in an abandoned cabin at 3 in the morning? Devereux approached the cabin, pressing his broad back against the rough, splintered wood of the exterior wall. He edged toward the single side window, the glass caked with years of grime and fresh soot. He held his breath, ignoring the burning ache in his lungs, and slowly turned his head to look inside. The interior was illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of a battery-powered camping lantern. And there, in the center of the dusty room, was Evelina. She was not wearing her heavy work clothes. She wore a thin, white camisole, her dark hair falling in loose, unkempt waves around her bare shoulders. And draped elegantly around her neck was the silk scarf from the Bozeman boutique. But it was the hands touching her that made Devereux's blood run ice cold. Xantha stood behind her, her arms wrapped possessively around Evelina's waist. The reporter's face was buried in the crook of Evelina's neck, trailing soft, lingering kisses along her collarbone. Evelina's eyes were closed, her head tilted back in a portrait of absolute, unadulterated surrender. Her hands rested over Xanthus, fingers intertwined in an intimate, familiar dance that spoke of months of hidden affection. It wasn't a doctor from the clinic. It wasn't a lonely ranch hand. It was Xantha, the scent that had haunted his bathroom. The dark vanilla and night-blooming jasmine suddenly made perfect, devastating sense. It belonged to the woman currently undressing his wife in the middle of a burning forest. Devereux stumbled back from the window, his shoulder hitting a wooden support beam. The world tilted dangerously on its axis. A wave of profound, physical nausea washed over him, dropping him to his knees in the dirt. He pressed a trembling hand over his mouth to stifle the ragged, broken sound trying to tear its way out of his throat. 7 years. 7 years of building a life, of weathering harsh winters and droughts, of whispered promises in the dark, all reduced to a cheap, illicit rendezvous in a rotting cabin. The sheer, grotesque reality of it stripped him of his pride, leaving him raw and bleeding in the ash-covered dirt. He looked up at the window, the soft light mocking the darkness inside him. He could kick the door off its hinges right now. He could shatter their stolen sanctuary with the roaring wrath of a betrayed husband. But as he knelt there in the suffocating heat, a cold, unnatural calm began to seep into his veins, extinguishing the fiery urge for an immediate, chaotic confrontation. The rage was still there, but it was morphing, hardening into something infinitely more dangerous. Devereux remained on his knees in the ash-choked dirt, his broad shoulders rising and falling with ragged, uneven breaths. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, but all he could smell was the sickeningly sweet ghost of night-blooming jasmine that had clung to his wife's pillow. Through the grimy window of the cabin, the soft, flickering light continued to dance, mocking him with the silhouettes of Evelina and Xantha, their bodies pressed together in a language of intimate betrayal. A violent tremor started in his hands, traveling up his forearms until his entire body shook. Every instinct honed by a lifetime on the rugged Montana ranch demanded action. The urge to kick the rotting wooden door off its hinges, to storm into that small, dusty room and tear their stolen paradise apart, roared like a furnace in his chest. He could picture it perfectly, the shock freezing Evelina's face, the frantic scramble for clothing, the stuttered, meaningless apologies dying on Xantha's lips. It would be a chaotic, fiery explosion of righteous anger. But as the seconds ticked by, heavy and agonizing, the roaring furnace began to cool. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the rough, splintered wood of the cabin's exterior wall. The initial shock was fading, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. If he confronted them now, he would be nothing more than a wild, unhinged husband acting out of desperation. He would surrender all his power to a fleeting moment of rage. They would control the narrative. They would spin the lies. Xantha, with her reporter's silver tongue, would find a way to make him the villain of his own tragedy. Devereux swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He would not give them the satisfaction of his destruction. He would not be the broken man screaming in the dark. He slowly pushed himself up from the dirt, his knees protesting the movement. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, taking painstaking care to ensure his heavy leather boots made no sound against the dry, combustible brush. Every step backward was a physical effort, a violent tearing away from the life he thought he knew. He retreated into the dense, suffocating shadows of the ponderosa pines, leaving the yellow glow of the cabin behind. The night swallowed him whole. The walk back to his truck felt like an eternity. He moved mechanically, his mind a chaotic storm of fragmented memories. He remembered their wedding day beneath the sprawling oak tree on the lower pasture, the way Evelina had looked at him with such fierce, unwavering devotion. He remembered the quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains. Now, those memories were tainted, infected by the parasitic truth he had just witnessed. How long had she been looking at Xana that way? How many late-night veterinary emergencies had been nothing more than cheap alibis for her dirty secret? When he finally reached his truck, hidden safely behind the thicket of dying pines, he didn't immediately get in. He leaned his weight against the cold metal of the door, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. The ash continued to fall around him, a silent, apocalyptic snowfall. He dug his hands into his pockets, his fingers brushing against his keys. He pulled them out, staring at the small, silver key that unlocked the front door of their ranch house. It felt heavy, loaded with a profound sense of loss. He was returning to a home that was no longer his, to a marriage that was dead but still breathing. Devereux climbed into the cab of his truck, the leather seat familiar and grounding. He didn't turn the key immediately. Instead, he sat in the suffocating silence, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. The betrayal had hollowed him out, but into that void rushed a dark, terrifying resolve. He wouldn't just leave her. He wouldn't just file for divorce and let them build their life on the ashes of his. He would find out exactly how deep this rot went. And then, he would burn it all to the ground. He turned the key, the engine purring to life with a low, menacing growl, and slowly reversed down the overgrown logging road, leaving the truth hidden in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sun crested the jagged peaks of the eastern ridge, a dull, blood-red disk struggling to pierce the thick curtain of wildfire smoke. Morning had arrived at the ranch, but the air still tasted like an open grave. Devereux stood at the kitchen sink, gripping a ceramic coffee mug so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The dark, bitter liquid inside had long gone cold. He hadn't slept a wink. Instead, he had spent the remaining hours of the night methodically erasing any trace of his midnight excursion, brushing the ash from his boots, smoothing the sheets on his side of the bed, and burying the cold, jagged shards of his shattered reality deep within his chest. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the familiar, heavy crunch of gravel signaled the return of Evelina's silver truck. Devereux didn't move. He closed his eyes, taking a long, slow breath, forcing his heart rate to slow, forcing his jaw to unclench. When he heard the heavy wooden door of the mudroom creak open, he arranged his features into the mask of the stoic, exhausted rancher she expected to see. Dev, her voice floated into the kitchen, soft and weary. He turned. Evelina stood in the doorway, a portrait of staged exhaustion. She was back in her heavy, ash-stained work clothes, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun that looked hastily constructed. To anyone else, she looked like a dedicated veterinarian returning from a grueling night of saving lives. But Devereux's eyes, newly sharpened by betrayal, saw the microscopic details she had missed. He saw the faint, barely there smudge of mascara beneath her left eye. He noticed the way her heavy canvas jacket was zipped unevenly, a careless mistake she never made. And beneath the overpowering scent of the wood smoke she had likely rolled her clothes in, the ghost of night-blooming jasmine still clung to her skin. "Morning, Evie," he said, his voice a low, even gravel. He forced himself to walk toward her, crossing the expanse of the kitchen that suddenly felt like a minefield. She offered him a weak, apologetic smile, letting her heavy equipment bag drop to the linoleum floor with a dull thud. "I'm so sorry, Dev. It was a nightmare out there. The fire jumped the line near Miller's Creek. We were up all night trying to evacuate a herd of yearlings. It was just chaos." The lie rolled off her tongue with a terrifying, practiced ease. It was a flawless performance, delivered with just the right amount of fatigue but as he watched her, the cold resolve in his chest solidified into something unbreakable. He would let her play her part. He would let her think she was safe in the dark. But the sun was coming up, and soon, there would be nowhere left for her to hide. The rhythmic, heavy breathing from the bedroom upstairs was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the ranch house. It was 10 a.m. The midday heat was already baking the dry Montana earth, the sky outside a thick, apocalyptic haze of orange and gray. Evelina had showered, scrubbing the smoke and the lingering scent of night-blooming jasmine from her skin, and collapsed into a deep, exhausted sleep. Devereux stood at the bottom of the staircase, his eyes fixed on the closed bedroom door. He listened for a full minute, assuring himself she was deeply under. Then, he turned away, his movements silent and purposeful, heading toward the small, converted guest room Evelina used as her home office. The door was locked. It had been locked for the past month, a new habit she claimed was necessary to protect sensitive veterinary records from their nosy, oversized sheepdog. At the time, Devereux hadn't questioned it. Now, the heavy brass knob felt like an insult. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the kitchen, retrieving a thin, sturdy metal pick from his toolkit in the mudroom. He had spent his youth fixing complex farm machinery. A standard household lock was child's play. He slipped the pick into the keyhole, his large, calloused hands remarkably steady. With a soft, metallic click, the mechanism yielded. Devereux pushed the door open, slipping inside and closing it silently behind him. The air in the office was stale, smelling faintly of paper and the same expensive perfume that had haunted him since 2:14 a.m. He moved systematically, a cold, calculating detachment settling over him. He wasn't a jealous husband anymore. He was an investigator combing through the wreckage of his own life. The desk was immaculate, stacks of neatly organized files regarding livestock vaccinations and billing statements. He ignored the obvious and went straight for the locked bottom drawer of her heavy oak filing cabinet. Using the same pick, he bypassed the simple lock in seconds. He pulled the heavy drawer open, the metal runners protesting with a soft squeak that made his heart hammer against his ribs. He froze, listening intently toward the stairs. Nothing. Only the steady hum of the central air conditioning. Inside the drawer, buried beneath old tax returns and blank veterinary certificates, was a small, padded manila envelope. Devereux pulled it out, his fingers tracing the outline of something hard and rectangular inside. He opened the clasp and dumped the contents onto the pristine surface of Evelina's desk. A cheap, black prepaid burner phone clattered against the wood. Beside it landed a small, silver key ring holding 2 keys, one brass, one steel. They didn't belong to the clinic, the truck, or any building on the ranch. Devereux stared at the brass key, the shape of it instantly recognizable. It was an old, heavy deadbolt key, the kind that would fit the rusted lock of an abandoned hunting cabin on Blackwood Ridge. He picked up the burner phone. The screen was dark, but a quick press of the power button brought it to life. It wasn't password protected. The arrogance of it made his blood boil. She hadn't even bothered to secure her secret life, so confident was she in his blind trust. He opened the messaging app. There was only one contact saved, listed simply as X. Devereux's thumb hovered over the screen. Reading the messages would be the point of no return. It would transform his agonizing suspicion into cold, undeniable fact. He took a steadying breath, the air burning his lungs, and tapped the thread. The messages spanned the last 4 months. They weren't just declarations of love or crude, illicit arrangements. They were something far darker. X, August 12th, 11:30 p.m. The wind shifted east. The line near Miller's Creek won't hold through the night. I'm filing the report in an hour. Evie, August 12th, 11:45 p.m. Perfect. I'll make sure the herds are evacuated toward the lower pasture. The panic should keep him distracted until morning. See you at the cabin. X, August 15th, 2 a.m. The county zoning meeting is set for next Tuesday. If the fire takes the eastern ridge, his property value drops another 30%. The bank will start calling. Evie, August 15th, 2:10 a.m. He's getting tired. X. He'll break soon. We just need to keep the pressure on. I can't wait to be out of this house. Devereux read the words again, and then a third time, the color draining from his face. The nausea returned, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a simple, devastating betrayal of the flesh. Evelina and Xantha weren't just sleeping together in the shadows of the wildfires. They were using the fires. The pieces snapped together with a sickening clarity. Xantha, with her press credentials and early access to fire movement reports. Evelina, With her veterinary authority to move livestock and her intimate knowledge of the ranch's vulnerabilities, they were orchestrating the destruction of his livelihood, manipulating the natural disaster to bankrupt him, to force him to sell the legacy ranch's grandfather had built from nothing. Devereux stared at the small, glowing screen, his vision blurring. The woman sleeping upstairs wasn't just unfaithful. She was a predator, patiently bleeding him dry while kissing him goodnight. The cold, calculated rage that had been simmering in his chest suddenly ignited, burning hotter and brighter than any fire ravaging the Montana hills. He wasn't just going to expose them. He was going to destroy them. The bell above the door of the diner jingled, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place in the ash-covered town of Pine Creek. It was 2 p.m., the heat outside practically visible in shimmering waves above the asphalt. The diner was packed with exhausted firefighters in yellow Nomex shirts, anxious locals, and the ubiquitous hum of the overhead news television broadcasting the latest wildfire containment figures. Devereux stepped inside, his broad shoulders practically blocking the doorway. He wore his faded denim jacket and a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the very image of a weary, hard-working rancher. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp and focused, until they landed on the corner booth. There she was. Xana sat alone, her posture rigid, aggressively typing on a sleek silver laptop. She wore a crisp, dark blue blouse that looked entirely unbothered by the oppressive heat or the soot in the air. A large, expensive-looking camera rested on the vinyl seat beside her, and her press pass dangled casually from her neck. She looked sharp, efficient, and dangerous. Devereux felt the familiar, sickening knot tighten in his stomach, but he forced his jaw to relax. He smoothed his features into a mask of polite, weary recognition and started toward her booth, the heavy thud of his boots cutting through the diner's chatter. He stopped at the edge of her table. Xana didn't look up immediately, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Excuse me," Devereux said, his voice a low, steady gravel. "Mind if I sit for a minute? Every other table is taken." Xana finally raised her head. Her eyes were a pale, striking gray, cold and calculating. They flicked over him, assessing his dusty boots, his worn jeans, and the exhaustion etched into his face. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps contempt, crossed her features before she smoothed it away with a practiced, professional smile. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth and modulated, the kind of voice built for delivering bad news on television. She gestured to the empty seat opposite her. "Mr. Devereux, isn't it? We met briefly at the town hall meeting last month." "We did," Devereux replied, sliding into the booth. The vinyl creaked under his weight. He kept his eyes locked on hers, searching for any sign of the woman he had seen in the cabin window just hours ago. "I've seen your reports on Channel 7. You've been busy." "It's a tragic season," Xana said smoothly, closing her laptop with a soft click. "The destruction is unprecedented. I'm just trying to keep the public informed. And how is your ranch holding up? I heard the fire line near Miller's Creek was dangerously close." The audacity of the question almost made him laugh. She knew exactly how close the fire was. She had known before he did. "We're managing," Devereux lied smoothly, leaning back against the seat, his posture relaxed despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Evelina's been a godsend. She's been out all night, every night, helping with the evacuations. I don't know how she does it." He watched her face closely. Xana didn't flinch. Her smile remained perfectly fixed, but the gray in her eyes hardened infinitesimally. "She's a very dedicated veterinarian. The county is lucky to have her." "Yeah," Devereux agreed, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "We're lucky to have her. It must be tough, though, working these fires, getting access to the restricted zones. I imagine you need a lot of inside information to get the story right." Xana's gaze sharpened. The polite facade slipped just enough for him to see the predator beneath. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "Journalism is about cultivating sources, Mr. Devereux. Finding the people who know the truth and getting them to talk. Sometimes, that means being in the right place at the right time." Or the wrong place, Devereux countered softly, the words hanging between them like a challenge. He let a long, agonizing beat of silence stretch out, watching as Xanda's perfectly manicured fingers twitched against the table. Before she could respond, the diner waitress appeared, slamming a mug of black coffee down in front of Devereux. The sharp clatter broke the tension. "Thanks, Betty," Devereux said, never taking his eyes off Xanda. He picked up the mug, the heat radiating into his palm. "Well, I shouldn't keep you from your work. The news never sleeps, right?" "No," Xanda replied, her voice tight, the smile completely gone now. "It doesn't." Devereux stood up, tossing a crumpled dollar bill onto the table. "You be careful out there, Xanda. The wind-up on Blackwood Ridge can shift real sudden. You wouldn't want to get caught in something you can't control." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the bell jingling cheerfully in his wake. The encounter had confirmed everything the burner phone had suggested. Xanda wasn't just a reporter looking for a story. She was a cold, calculating woman playing a very dangerous game. And Devereux had just let her know, in the most subtle way possible, that he was no longer a pawn. He was a player. The air conditioning inside the Pine Creek County Courthouse hummed with a lethargic, asthmatic wheeze, doing little to combat the stifling August heat pressing against the thick glass windows. Devereux stood at the polished oak counter of the zoning and planning office, his Stetson held loosely in his hands, his posture radiating a weary, patient exhaustion he didn't feel. The clerk, an older woman with thick glasses and a permanently harried expression, was frantically sorting through a stack of manila folders, oblivious to the storm raging behind Devereux's stoic facade. "I'm sorry, Mr. Devereux," she muttered, pushing her glasses up her nose. "With the fires, everyone is pulling emergency zoning maps. It's a mess back here." "Take your time, Martha," Devereux replied, his voice a low, even rumble. He leaned heavily against the counter, projecting the image of a man simply trying to assess the damage to his property lines. "I just need to see the recent parcel revaluations for the Eastern Ridge, particularly the sections bordering Miller's Creek and the Blackwood Tracks." Martha sighed, pulling a thick ledger from a lower shelf and dropping it onto the counter with a heavy thud. "Here are the public records for the last 6 weeks. It's all categorized by parcel number." She gave him a sympathetic look. "I know it's been rough up your way. Evelina must be working herself to the bone." "She is," Devereux said smoothly, ignoring the phantom pain that flared in his chest at his wife's name. "She truly is." As Martha bustled away to answer a ringing phone, Devereux pulled the ledger toward him, his eyes immediately scanning the dense columns of numbers and legal jargon. The burner phone in his pocket felt like a lump of lead. He knew what he was looking for, but seeing it documented in cold, bureaucratic ink was a different kind of devastating. He found his property lines, the legacy ranch his grandfather had built, and traced his finger down the recent valuations. His breath caught in his throat. The assessed value of his land, particularly the prime grazing acreage near Miller's Creek, had plummeted by nearly 40% in the last month. The notes attached to the devaluation cited high risk of imminent fire damage and unstable topography due to recent burn patterns. Devereux frowned, his brow furrowing. The fire hadn't touched Miller's Creek. It had come close, yes, but the wind had shifted. He knew his land better than he knew the back of his own hand. The topography was perfectly stable. He flipped back a few pages, searching for the source of the assessments. There, neatly typed in the margin of a revised zoning map, was a familiar name. Independent Environmental Assessment, Xanda Collins, Channel 7 News via the Pine Creek Conservation Board. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening, audible click in his mind. Xanda wasn't just reporting the news. She was actively creating it. She was using her press credentials and her position on the local conservation board to file fraudulent environmental reports, exaggerating the threat of the wildfires to his specific parcels of land. The county, overwhelmed by the crisis, was rubber-stamping her assessments. But why? The answer was buried 2 pages later, in a section detailing recent land acquisitions. A newly formed LLC, Blackwood Holdings, had aggressively purchased 3 distressed properties bordering Devereux's ranch in the last 2 weeks, buying them for pennies on the dollar from ranchers desperate to escape the fires. Devereux quickly scanned the incorporation documents attached to the LLC. The registered agent was a law firm in Bozeman, but the secondary contact, the local representative authorized to sign on behalf of the holding company, was a name he recognized instantly. Evelina Devereux. He stared at his wife's name, the neat, impersonal font blurring before his eyes. The breath rushed out of his lungs, leaving him hollow and cold. This was the master plan. The affair was merely the twisted, rotting foundation of a much larger crime. Xantha used her influence to devalue the land. Evelina used her insider knowledge and the chaotic cover of the fires to position them perfectly. They were squeezing him dry, terrifying his neighbors into selling, and orchestrating a scenario where the bank would inevitably call on his loans, forcing him to sell the legacy ranch to Blackwood Holdings. They were going to steal his history, his home, and his future, all while Evelina kissed him goodnight and played the exhausted, heroic veterinarian. Martha returned to the counter, wiping her brow with a tissue. "Find what you needed, Dev?" "Yes, Martha," Devereux said, slowly closing the heavy ledger. His voice was terrifyingly calm, stripped of all emotion. "I found exactly what I needed." He pushed the book across the polished oak, his knuckles white with the effort of restraint. He didn't thank her. He turned and walked out of the courthouse, the oppressive August heat hitting him like a physical blow. But he didn't feel it. He was already dead inside. All that remained was the cold, calculating executioner, ready to burn their empire to the ground. The wind shifted mid-afternoon, howling down from the eastern ridge like a dying, suffocating breath. It carried the bitter scent of scorched earth and the terrifying promise of acceleration. Devereux stood alone on the porch of the ranch house, a heavy canvas duster snapping around his calves, watching the sky bruise into an angry, apocalyptic purple. The county alert system on his phone had just buzzed. Mandatory evacuation order, Blackwood Ridge and surrounding sectors. Immediate action required. He didn't move. He simply stared at the churning smoke, a cold, empty calm settling deep within his chest. The fire was moving fast, eating through the dry, dead ponderosa pines exactly as he knew it would. He had spent his entire life studying the volatile weather patterns of this valley. He knew the wind, he knew the terrain, and more importantly, he knew his enemy. Devereux pulled the burner phone from his pocket, the screen cracked but functional. He had spent the last 2 hours cloning its data, downloading every damning text, every fraudulent environmental assessment, every digital footprint of Blackwood Holdings. He had packaged it neatly into an encrypted file, ready to be sent to the state attorney general, the IRS, and the local news station that employed Xantha. But exposure wasn't enough. Justice, cold and bureaucratic, would take years. He needed something immediate. He needed them to feel the heat. He tapped out a message, his large fingers moving with terrifying precision. He sent it to Xantha from Evelina's burner number. "Evie," the bank called. "He found the deed to the Miller's Creek parcel in my office. He's going to the authorities. Meet me at the cabin right now. We need to get the physical files out before the evacuation cuts us off." He hit send, his face an impassive mask, and immediately powered the phone down, tossing it onto the porch railing. He didn't wait for a reply. He knew exactly what Xantha would do. The reporter was too arrogant to panic, too deeply invested in her own scheme to walk away from the tangible proof hidden in that cabin. She would rush to save her empire. And Evelina, currently miles away at the triage center, completely unaware of the message, would be the tragic casualty of Xantha's greed. Devereux turned and walked back into the house, the silence ringing in his ears. He moved through the rooms with the deliberate, heavy steps of a ghost haunting its own grave. He stopped in the kitchen, grabbing a heavy iron crowbar from the mudroom and a pair of thick leatherwork gloves. He didn't look at the wedding photo on the mantel. He didn't let his eyes linger on the worn spot on the rug where Evelina liked to read on Sunday mornings. He severed every emotional tie, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man executing a flawless, devastating maneuver. 10 minutes later, his truck was tearing up the treacherous, rutted logging road toward Blackwood Ridge. The air was a thick, unbreathable soup of ash and heat. The sky was a solid, terrifying wall of orange. The fire was miles closer than it had been 2 nights ago, the roar of it a low, continuous thunder in the distance. He reached the turnoff, bypassing the yellow barricade that was now melted and warped by the ambient heat. He parked a mile down the road, hiding his truck behind a dense outcropping of rock, ensuring it wouldn't block the path. He walked the rest of the way, the heavy crowbar resting comfortably on his shoulder. The cabin materialized through the smoke, looking even more dilapidated in the harsh, unnatural daylight. Devereux didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the rotting porch, inserted the heavy iron tip of the crowbar between the door and the frame, and pushed. The rusted lock gave way with a sickening crunch of splintering wood. He stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling faintly of old dust and the sickeningly sweet ghost of night-blooming jasmine. He ignored the makeshift bed in the corner. He went straight for the heavy metal strongbox hidden beneath the loose floorboards, the box he had discovered during a previous, agonizing search. He didn't open it. He simply used the crowbar to smash the padlock, rendering it impossible to close securely again. He scattered the contents, forged deeds, blank county seals, and stacks of cash, across the dusty table. He made it look like a frantic, desperate search had already taken place. Then, he stepped outside, pulling the heavy wooden door shut. He jammed a thick, heavy wedge of firewood under the base of the door, effectively barricading it from the outside. It wasn't designed to keep someone out. It was designed to delay anyone trying to leave in a panic. Devereux retreated to the tree line, blending into the shadows of the massive, dying pines. The heat was becoming unbearable, the roar of the approaching fire growing louder by the second. He checked his watch. 20 minutes. He stood perfectly still, his heart a steady, unforgiving metronome, waiting for the red taillights of Xanda's SUV to pierce the smoke, ready to spring the trap that would burn their lives to ash. The roar of the wildfire was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical weight pressing against the mountainside, a deafening freight train of consuming heat and cracking timber. Ash fell like dirty snow, thick enough to coat Devereux's duster in a layer of gray. He stood motionless in the suffocating shadows of the pines, his eyes fixed on the rutted logging road. First came the sleek, black SUV, cutting through the smoke with reckless speed, its tires spinning in the loose dirt before skidding to a halt near the cabin. Xanda practically threw herself out of the driver's seat, coughing into the crook of her arm, her immaculate blue blouse already stained with soot. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy crunch of gravel signaled a second vehicle. Evelina's silver truck tore into the clearing, the emergency lights still flashing on the dashboard. She killed the engine and scrambled out, her face pale beneath the grime of her triage shift. "Xanda!" Evelina screamed over the roar of the wind, her voice frantic. "What are you doing here? The evacuation order went out 20 minutes ago. The ridge is gone." Xanda spun around, her eyes wide and panicked. "What do you mean? You texted me. You said Dev found the deeds. You said to meet you here to get the files." Evelina stopped dead in her tracks, the color draining entirely from her face. "I didn't text you. I've been at the clinic. I came because the GPS tracker on your car showed you heading straight into the red zone." The realization hit them simultaneously, a sickening, terrifying silence falling between them despite the roaring inferno closing in. They turned toward the cabin. Devereux stepped out of the shadows. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, the heavy iron crowbar resting casually against his thigh. He didn't look like the exhausted, oblivious husband they had left that morning. He looked like the mountain itself, immovable, unforgiving, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Dev," Evelina gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands flew to her mouth, the triage equipment bag dropping from her shoulder into the dirt. Xanda froze, her sharp features contorting into a mask of pure, survivalist terror. She calculated the distance to her SUV, but Devereux was already positioned between them and the vehicles. "Afternoon, ladies," Devereux said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that somehow cut through the deafening noise of the approaching fire. "Looks like you both got my message." "Dev, please," Evelina pleaded, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "It's not, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly, Evie," he replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. He gestured with the crowbar toward the barricaded door of the cabin. "I understand that while I was fixing fences and trying to keep this ranch afloat, you were out here playing house with the local news. And I understand that Blackwood Holdings has been very busy buying up the ashes of my neighbors." Xana's jaw tightened. The panic in her eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating ambition that had orchestrated this entire nightmare. "You're insane, Devereux. You have no proof of anything. This is a wildfire zone. If you don't move your truck, we're all going to burn." Devereux didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, manila envelope, heavily sealed with tape. "I don't need to move my truck, Xana. I walked the last mile." And as for proof, he tossed the envelope into the dirt between them. It landed with a heavy thud, splitting open to reveal copies of the forged environmental assessments, the LLC incorporation documents, and transcripts of their text messages. "I already sent the originals to the state attorney general," Devereux stated, watching Xana's face crumble as her empire dissolved in the ash. "And to your station manager at Channel 7. Your career is over. And Evie," he finally turned his gaze fully onto his wife. The physical pain of it nearly buckled his knees, but he held firm, locking away the 7 years of love they had shared into a dark, inaccessible vault. "Your veterinary license will be revoked by Monday for falsifying quarantine reports." Evelina fell to her knees, sobbing violently, the reality of her total destruction crushing her. "Dev, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I loved you, I swear I did. But we were drowning in debt. The ranch was failing. The ranch was failing because she was choking it." Devereux roared, the sudden explosion of his voice startling them both. He pointed the crowbar at Xana. "She devalued the land, and you handed her the keys to my home." A massive ponderosa pine 50 yards away exploded into a tower of flame, the heat washing over them in a suffocating wave. The sky was no longer orange. It was the color of fresh blood. The fire line had crested the ridge. They had minutes, maybe less. "We have to go," Xana screamed, abandoning all pretense of control. She lunged toward her SUV. Devereux stepped into her path, his massive frame blocking the driver's side door. The crowbar rested heavily in his hand. He wasn't going to hit her. He didn't need to. The fire was about to do the work for him. The roar of the inferno was now a physical entity, a deafening, monstrous entity swallowing the oxygen from the air. A shower of burning embers rained down on the clearing, hissing as they struck the metal hoods of the parked vehicles. The heat was a solid wall, blistering the skin on Devereux's face, but he didn't blink. He stood rooted before Xana's sleek black SUV, an immovable force of nature more terrifying than the fire itself. Xana recoiled from him, her eyes wide with a primal, animalistic panic. The sharp, ambitious reporter was gone, replaced by a woman staring at her own violent end. She looked at the crowbar in Devereux's hand, then at the wall of flames advancing rapidly through the pines behind the cabin. "You're going to kill us," Xana choked out, coughing violently as the thick, black smoke filled her lungs. "You're actually going to let us burn for a piece of land." "I'm not letting you burn for land, Xana," Devereux yelled. He looked at Xana, who was already scrambling frantically for the door handle of her SUV. "Your fancy truck won't make it down that goat path, Xana. The suspension will snap before you hit the first switchback." He turned back to Evelina, who was slowly pushing herself up from the dirt, her eyes fixed on him with a desperate, terrified hope. "Evie's truck is 4-wheel drive. She knows the pass. It's the only vehicle getting off this mountain today." He let the reality of the situation sink in. The silence between the three of them was heavier than the smoke. "But here's the deal," Devereux continued, his voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. He pointed to the thick, Manila envelopes still lying in the dirt, the physical copies of their fraudulent empire. You don't take the files. You leave the deeds, the LLC paperwork, the burn reports. You leave it all here to burn with the cabin. You leave with nothing but the clothes on your backs and the knowledge that the state attorney general already has the digital copies. Are you insane? Xanda shrieked, slamming her hand against the hood of her SUV. That's millions of dollars. That's my entire career. We can't just leave it. Then stay with it, Devereux countered smoothly, stepping backward into the shadows of the tree line where he had parked his own truck a mile down. Burn with your empire, Xanda. It's your choice. Another massive pine crashed to the ground 50 yards away, sending a shower of sparks into the air that ignited the dry brush surrounding the cabin. The heat was now unbearable, singeing the hair on Devereux's arms. Evelina didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the envelope, and she didn't look at Xanda. She stumbled toward her silver truck, her movements jerky and panicked. She threw open the driver's side door, coughing violently. Get in, Xanda. Evelina screamed, her voice tearing. Get in the truck now, or I'm leaving you. Xanda stared at the envelope in the dirt, the physical manifestation of her greed and ambition. The flames were licking at the edges of the rotting cabin porch. She let out a guttural scream of absolute rage and defeat, abandoning her SUV and sprinting toward Evelina's truck. She threw herself into the passenger seat. Evelina slammed the truck into gear, the heavy tires spinning violently in the dirt before finding purchase. They tore down the logging road, kicking up a massive cloud of ash and dust, disappearing into the thick smoke heading toward the treacherous quarry pass. Devereux stood alone in the clearing. He didn't watch them go. He turned his back on the escaping truck and walked slowly toward the tree line where his own vehicle waited safely out of the fire's immediate path. He had won. He had secured his legacy, destroyed their fraudulent empire, and exposed their devastating betrayal. The trap had worked perfectly, but as he walked away, leaving the cabin and the physical evidence to be consumed by the roaring flames, he felt absolutely nothing. The sky above Pine Creek eventually bled out its angry orange, settling into a bruised, suffocating gray that stretched for weeks. The Blackwood Ridge fire had burned itself out, stopped by a sudden, violent rainstorm that turned the ash into a thick, black sludge. The abandoned hunting cabin was gone, reduced to a smoldering footprint in the dirt, taking Xanda's sleek black SUV and the physical evidence of their fraudulent empire with it. Devereux stood on the porch of the ranch house, the air still heavy with the scent of wet soot. It was early September, a time when the valley usually hummed with the golden light of approaching autumn. Now, it was a charred, silent graveyard. He gripped the wooden railing, his large, calloused hands remarkably steady. The legacy ranch, the hundreds of acres his grandfather had bled for, the prime grazing land near Miller's Creek, was safe. The property lines remained intact, untouched by the orchestrated flames and the predatory greed of Blackwood Holdings. He had won. The state attorney general had moved swiftly on the encrypted files Devereux had sent. The local news station had fired Xanda before the weekend was out, issuing a terse, public apology for her unprecedented breach of journalistic integrity. Evelina's veterinary license had been suspended pending a criminal investigation into the falsified quarantine reports and the manipulation of livestock movements. They had lost everything they had built in the shadows, their reputations incinerated faster than the ponderosa pines. Evelina had tried to call him twice in the days following the fire. He hadn't answered. He hadn't changed the locks on the house, because he knew she would never come back. The silence in the heavy, wood-paneled rooms was absolute, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Devereux let out a long, slow breath, watching a single, gray flake of ash drift down from the overcast sky to land on the toe of his worn leather boot. He remembered the feral, terrified look in Evelina's eyes as she threw her truck into gear and tore down the treacherous quarry pass. He had forced her to choose between her life and the dark, ambitious secret she had nurtured with another woman. He had watched them flee like frightened animals, stripped of their power and their dignity. It was a flawless execution of vengeance. Yet, standing alone on his porch, looking out over the vast, empty expanse of his saved land, Devereux felt completely hollowed out. The victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He had protected the ranch, but the home he had built inside it was gone. The morning coffee they used to share, the quiet evenings watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, the comforting weight of her presence in the bed beside him. It was all dead, burned away by a betrayal so profound it had altered the fundamental structure of his soul. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket, his fingers brushing against a small, hard object. He pulled it out. It was Evelina's silver wedding band. He had found it sitting perfectly centered on the kitchen island 2 days after the fire, a silent, final concession. She hadn't left a note. She didn't need to. Devereux rolled the cold metal between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't feel the crushing agony he had experienced outside the cabin window. The raw, bleeding wound of betrayal had cauterized, leaving behind a thick, numb scar tissue. He was no longer the loving, trusting husband who had built this life. He was the cold, calculating survivor who had destroyed it to save himself. He walked slowly down the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He walked toward the edge of the lower pasture, where the sprawling oak tree, the tree they had been married under, stood dark and solitary against the gray sky. He stopped beneath its heavy, ancient branches. The silence of the ranch was deafening. He was the master of his domain, the undisputed owner of a legacy secured through ruthless precision. He had everything he had fought for, and absolutely nothing that mattered. Devereux looked down at the silver ring in his palm one last time, the metal dull and lifeless under the heavy clouds. He closed his fist around it, the edges biting into his skin. He stood perfectly still, a solitary figure in a landscape of ruin, watching the gray smoke finally begin to clear. The fire didn't take everything from me, Devereux whispered to the empty, ash-covered valley. I gave it away.